Okay, my name is Kenny Johnson, Director of Product Ops. I am here talking with Daniel about an issue we were discussing, and now I lost the issue, about using Terraform to provision new cluster creation. And there was a dialogue about whether or not, what tier that should go in. So I'm going to share my screen, Daniel, and we can talk about it. Cool, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, only a part of it. Only half your browser window. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay, it paused. Okay. So Victor had asked for a call, but now I think Victor is on a plane. But let's discuss. So, as I understand the issue, there is some consideration for today when we provision a cluster through the attach a cluster interface in GitLab. The definition of how we do that is stored in Ruby code and then is kind of like executed within the Ruby part of the application. And there's a question about whether or not we should just kind of, similar to how what we're doing with the ability once you have a cluster to manage the configuration of that cluster in terms of the managed apps that are installed and their specific configuration in a separate cluster configuration project. Should we do the same thing and have a similar experience for the actual deployment of the infrastructure of the cluster using something like Terraform? Is that a fair summary, maybe?
Yes, I think that it's important to point out that we're only discussing this for new cluster creation, right?
Okay.
So when you add an existing cluster, kind of the flow would be different. Yeah.
Oh, gotcha. When you were wanting to, if it was a cluster that was already provisioned, the flow would be different.
Right, exactly. If you're new to GitLab, but you already have a Kubernetes practice in your company, then what you would be doing is add existing cluster and plugging in your API URLs, your tokens, your CA certs, all that stuff. Yeah.
Gotcha. So that is this create new cluster, not add
existing
cluster. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you choose one of these, there's a provisioning process. And the question is, should we use Terraform? And then one of the pain points that would solve is then you would understand explicitly and have defined explicitly how the cluster was created. And presumably, if you wanted to adjust that configuration, you could do it in GitLab source control. Okay. Cool. I think the crux of the question, if I'm correct, was really what tier should this be in? Is that your read of it too?
So I think that there's a couple of things, right? So there's first the whole workflow, right? If you come across any error, it's no longer going to be a GitLab error that we have control over, but it's going to be a Terraform thing that you may or may not understand. So kind of that experience in my mind is vastly different. And the second thing, I think that as terms of tier goes, our Kubernetes integration is kind of a part of our core tier. And I think that it would have to continue to be the same way, right? Like if we're saying the only way you can provision a cluster on a cloud provider is if you're in a paid tier, that's kind of not the intent. That would be kind of taken away from what we have today.
Yeah, I think that is definitely true. We would never want to take away. I think maybe Victor's underlying question was, but if you wanted, let's say we used Terraform under the covers and you kind of described this as like completely opaquely, the user experience today was exactly the same, but we just happened to use Terraform. That obviously that same experience that's been in core should remain in core, but the question I think was, if you ever choose to kind of like break out from that convention and start configuring, like we now expose that project to you and you want to adjust that with infrastructure as code primitives, should that be in a paid tier? So the experience that I'll liken this to is today, what I can do in the configuration in my cluster is add this extra infrastructure project, and we're talking about doing this by default. The idea would be, well, we've created a cluster provisioning, or maybe it's something other than the word infrastructure, a cluster project that manages the configuration of the cluster itself and the kind of resources of the cluster itself.
Yep.
Is my interaction with that, once I have it created, would we suggest that any like merge request to this that would update it would also be in a paid tier? And that's where I have a really hard time thinking that we would want to do that, because yeah, it's essentially like auto DevOps. We give you auto DevOps, but auto DevOps you can break apart, and we should allow you to break apart our conventions without having to move to a higher tier.
Yeah, so there's something there for sure that if we're saying, provision clusters with your Terraform setup, and that is a paid feature, that may be very valuable. And I can think of use cases where we've come across like very large customers that have created tools like this with their own tooling. So we had one specific customer in the financial sector that created a Jupyter notebook as a portal for their developers to log in and specify the details of the cluster. And in the backend, they had some tooling to create that cluster. So I could imagine if you're an on-prem or self-managed customer, and your developers are basically provisioning infrastructure on either on-prem or your private cloud, that this could serve as a way of you saying, well, I don't want to use GCP or AWS, but I'm going to go the custom route and offer this cluster creation experience to my developers, and in the backend is going to use Terraform. So that could be, if we see it, that additional functionality is in a paid tier, I could see how that makes more sense instead of a complete replacement of what we have today.
Yeah, but I do think, sorry, and I'm more, just to be explicit, my argument is that for the first iterations, we're going to be talking about, I think of it in a very similar model to what we've just been doing with the moving from non-CI to CI GitLab managed apps. You would be doing the same thing, moving from CI to non-CI cluster creation or cluster management, where we provision it. We gave you the stock convention. If you want to break out of that, you can. Those will deploy with CI, and that will likely use Terraform, or we might choose to use Terraform. I would argue that still remains in core. The things that might move up in tier are some of the other experiences around Terraform management. So, whether that's managing multiple projects of Terraform and understanding changes across different infrastructures, or some of the collaboration tools around reviewing Terraform state changes that Victor has been proposing and the team is working on. Those seem like more appropriate higher tier ones, rather than the thing that strikes me as not compatible with our tier structures is the notion that just because I want to not use GitLab's stock convention, that means I'm in a higher tier. That doesn't flow with the rest of our tiering philosophies today.
Yeah, so that's a fair point. I think that one vastly different comparison between GitLab managed apps that are CI based and cluster creation that's Terraform based is that we are using GitLab and a GitLab and a GitLab primitive and a GitLab feature to provision or install those applications. Whereas here, we would be using a tool that's external to GitLab. So we couldn't count on users having to have kind of the same experience with it, or even, there are other things like overhead in an omnibus type of installation, or even a Helm chart type of installation. If you're installing GitLab, now you're adding that overhead of you must provision Terraform for this feature to work. And, that's also kind of a consideration, right? So yeah, there are all these things that are kind of analogous, but not really.
Well, and I think that argument is maybe not about tiering, right? That is just about, should we do this? Because if we replace the existing experience, but it requires more overhead, deeper understanding, something else before you could create a cluster, that does seem like a step backwards. If we could completely obscure that from users and the experience was literally the exact same, that should be what we're after. But that, I think, is independent of what tier it goes in, right? That's just should we even move to having Terraform cluster provisioning because it comes with all these additional usability concerns. The tiering one is the one that I wanted to make sure we had a dialogue about, and Victor's not here, so I'm not necessarily sure I'm representing his side of the argument, but I'm probably presuming that we would go down the path of doing this, and if we do, and it would be opaque, I would suggest it still remains in core. I totally agree that there's still a bunch of validation, both on problem and solution, about whether or not this is the right thing to go do. Yeah. Maybe that's the better thing. Like, maybe the result is, let's not talk about tiers until we decide this is actually something we think is important and the next thing to do. Then we can have a discussion about which tier it goes into.
Yeah, I think that I do agree that the core of this experience, forgive the redundance, should remain in core. And I think that if we're basing it especially on Terraform, which is also open source, kind of that all signs are pointing us to, keep it in core, basically, is what I think.
Okay. Okay. But it sounds like the primary questions that you have that we need to answer first are, is this worth, is there a pain point here, and can we solve it in a way that doesn't add even more complexity?
Yep,
because it does
exactly.
seems like we would be doing this in order to allow for some additional customization and infrastructure management, but it comes with preventing people from getting started. It might come with preventing people from getting started with adding a cluster and creating a cluster quickly. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you for talking through this with me.
All right.
I'm gonna stop the
Thanks,
recording.
Kenny.
Yep. Thanks, Daniel.